So it's quite crucial to go back to basics and do the calculations for your fund. Now, we know the default investment strategy is crucial. It's very comforting that Treasury have come out with new draft regulations in terms of relooking at the default. But why is it so important? Is because most members stay in the default. Alexander Forbes came out, it was John Anderson who was once quoted as saying 85% of people tend to stay in the default investment strategy. And that was explained by the participation paradox, the fact that people want to know they have member investment choice, but in fact many people actually use it. Well, we've got a theory that the reason people stay in the default is that they trust their employer and they trust their fund. And so if the trustees with access to all the best consultants and advice that are out there have devised a strategy for them, well, who are they to second guess what's been put in place? So what does an individual want? Well, much as like getting on an airplane, they know where they want to get to, but they want you to get them there. And so that's what a default ideally would do. It would take them to that income that's been targeted by the fund. And so in our framework for investment, we distinguish between two different types of assets. The risk-free portfolio, which we've identified as consisting of inflation-linked bonds, and a growth portfolio, something that's going to power them. It's an engine. It's going to give you maximum returns. It's going to largely consist of equities and maybe some offshore assets. And so what we want to do is change the allocation between growth and risk-free through time to power us towards the goal that's been appropriately chosen for the members of that fund. So in theory, if I had an individual who was sitting 1 or 2 years from retirement and they were on track to achieve the goal that's been set by the fund, and these goals are never easy to get to, even if it was 65%. Remember, that was assuming I was going to get 5% real each and every year from the time they started contributing. If they can get there with not taking any risk, well, then I can take the equity exposure off the table and put them into a portfolio that's risk-free, and here risk-free means guaranteeing the income that's been targeted for them, and in this instance, it would be the inflation-linked bonds. But if they're falling short of the target and we need to get them there, well, we need to take risk. Risk is a tool that can be used to achieve the goal. And so what we have is a current life stage paradigm where we are only making asset allocation changes based on the number of years you have from retirement. There is no revisiting of the goal. There is no looking whether you're on track for a particular replacement ratio, even if it's been determined for the fund, appropriate or not. We literally make changes to two members in two different situations based on the number of years they have from retirement. And so what we want is a portfolio change that may happen due to two main factors, market-related or individual reasons. So what could happen year on year is that an individual could have exceptional growth in their growth portfolio. They may see a 30-40% return coming out of their equities. They could see interest rates moving up or down, inflation being lower than expected. But how on track you are to meet your liability at the end of the year will change quite dramatically based on these live market events. We also have individual reasons. People get different salary increases. They could change their contribution rates towards retirement funding. They could even change the income goal, though in the default strategy they wouldn't. Or they could change their retirement date. And so what you want is a framework that, without being engaged, will make the right changes, taking into account all of those circumstances. And this is not something that's been cooked up in a university professor's laboratory. These are types of things that as actuaries we're well placed to be able to do, to be able to take the systems and technology and make those changes. Now, most individuals are unengaged when they join the fund. They're concentrating on their career, and they should be. They shouldn't be too concerned about retirement provision. It's a long time off. It's something that doesn't feel like it's ever going to happen. But at some point, people start to become engaged. For some, it might be the day they retire. For others, there may be a period before. And so what you want is to be able to have an ability for that individual to actually say what their own goal is. So Lindiwe may have received a statement and seen that she's on track for 7,200 Rand a month. Only Lindiwe can know whether that's sufficient. Suppose the goal was always to get her to 7,200 when you look at the replacement ratio. If Lindiwe wants to boost her retirement income, there are only 3 things she can do. And we should be able to give her the mechanism to be able to do it. It's like going to the doctor and being told, don't worry about retirement, you're not getting there, you've got high cholesterol. And you're going to say, okay, well, that's great, you're going to leave the office. Of course not. You're going to say, well, what can I do? And they're going to tell you can take statins, or you can exercise, or you can eat better. And those are the emergency actions that you will take if you want to get there. And the same with that 7,200. It's set in a way that hopefully if Lindiwe is quite shocked because she needs 8,000 or more, she can do something. And so the statement should go a little bit further than just delivering the news. It might show what a higher contribution rate would be able to do. And with some generous tax deductibility coming next year, hopefully she can take advantage of that. She could potentially show her the impact of retiring later. And if that's not possible within the fund, at the very least, show the damage of retiring earlier, or potentially take more investment risk. So we can show that on a statement, all done in a way that Lindiwe can understand, and hopefully the facility is in place to be able to do it. But if it's not within the fund, then at least she knows to be able to save outside in some other tax-efficient vehicle. So if Lindiwe was 100% funded when 7,200 was the target, because that's what we believed that she was invested in, she would be in the risk-free portfolio. But if she needed 8,000 Rand as the target, well, she cannot be. She needs to take some risk if she's not going to contribute more. And so what you want is a framework that allows equities or other asset classes to come in to try and power her towards her new goal that she's allocated. Now, an inflation-linked annuity was used in this framework, and I understand that there's probably a lot of questions about the use of other annuity types. Of course they could be used. But we were looking at something that could be used as a default investment strategy. And we submit that inflation-linked annuity is the risk-free option for an individual because it removes all three of the risks of inflation, investment, and longevity. If I was asked about sun protection, about someone's child that were running out, what would you tell them? Don't worry, go run outside in the 35-degree heat at 12 o'clock midday. You would say absolutely not. You would say wear a hat, wear sunglasses, SPF 30 or higher, maybe 50, umbrella, maybe you put on a shirt. Because when you're trying to give risk-free advice, you give the risk-free advice. But if you know a little bit more, maybe it's cloudy, it's 4 o'clock in the day, different complexion, etc., you may give different advice. And so, whilst the inflation-linked annuity may be risk-free default, it does not imply that the risk-free choice is always the most appropriate option for the member. And in fact, the framework should never force anyone to go into that type of investment strategy at retirement. They should still be free to choose anything else. But at least in the absence of knowing anything else, this gives a sensible default for that individual. So trustees, on the advice of their consultants or actuaries, might elect a different annuity type, and that different annuity type will have implications for the risk-free asset. So if you think that a 5% per annum escalating level annuity is the right option, well then an appropriate nominal bond portfolio will be able to be the risk-free asset in our analysis. The other annuity types that are out there might be with-profit annuities, and it could be done around that. So as long as the risk-free asset is corresponding to it, and we could get a market-consistent price, it fits neatly into the framework. The one argument that I would not buy is the living annuity, and the fact that ASISA stats show that 80% of annuities purchased at retirement are living annuities does not make it a good choice. If you used PA90 minus 2 with 1% per annum improvement, and you had a couple, 65 years old, and they were both retiring, based on that mortality table, and I'm sure most of you will agree that's a pretty normal mortality table to use, there is a 50% chance that one of that couple age 65 who retire together will live to age 90. That's a lot of longevity risk. And if you watched this morning, if you were living in a blue zone, if you're living to 103, you're well beyond the expectations of what the living annuity would be able to provide. And so as I end off the presentation, I look at this particular logo, the FedEx logo. Some of you may have heard me present on it before. I actually prefer DHL, but I use the FedEx logo. And why I like this logo is because between the E and the X, there is an arrow. And until I had that pointed out to me, I had never noticed it. And now I cannot see this logo without ever seeing that particular arrow. Maybe that'll all happen to you now. But I'm hoping that during the course of this presentation, there have been certain ideas, and there have been a few, that have resonated with you. And maybe when you look at things and you're going back to looking at things the way you used to, you'll challenge it and have a look and say, well, does that make sense? Because whilst these are just our ideas, we do think that they are practical and implementable and hopefully something that you've been able to take on board in terms of your own practices. So in terms of summarizing the ideas of this presentation, what we did is establish the goal of a DC fund as being there to provide a good standard of living in retirement. We also said that that can be achieved by providing a stream of inflation-linked income in retirement for as long as that member is alive. There's therefore an implicit liability for each and every member of the fund, and that's not the fund credit. The income target should be expressed as a replacement ratio. That's nothing new, but that the target should be appropriate and achievable. You should look at market-consistent assumptions in terms of coming up with what that is and potentially revisit that replacement ratio from what was there in the past and have it as a live document from time to time, a living paper. Ad hoc rules of thumb and older targets are unlikely to be appropriate, and that target should be adjusted based on how long an individual actually spends within the fund. There are implications for the risk-free asset once you define how you are going to pay that income in retirement. And so if you are trying to provide inflation-linked income, well then inflation-linked bonds, an appropriately structured inflation-linked bond portfolio, is what can be used to track that cost. So risk-free in this context is not cash, and it's generally not nominal instruments. It's essential to incorporate the member's human capital. It's possible to determine whether a member is on track only by taking that into account, because ultimately that is one thing that an individual has some control over. They can add additional contributions into the melting pot. And it is possible to select a portfolio of assets that will maximize the likelihood of that particular individual getting to their level of real retirement income, or at least their goal when they get there. And this shouldn't require member intervention. It should be done at the back scenes, targeting it as an autopilot, as it would if you were flying to any other destination. We need to distinguish between providing meaningful and important information. A fund credit will always be important. That will always have to feature somewhere on the statement. But let's not place undue emphasis on it and encourage the wrong type of behavior. And lastly, we believe the life stage approach that is so heavily in use today, not only in South Africa, but around the world, fails to meet a lot of these design criteria that have been put forward. In South Africa, we have the tools required to make substantial changes. We shouldn't take for granted that we have an inflation-linked bond market with inflation-linked bonds that go out to 2050. Yes, maybe it doesn't have the level of liquidity that ideally we would want, but that will grow in time as it has already. We've got a thriving insurance market. We've got inflation-linked annuities. We've got nominal annuities. The jurisdictions like the UK, that's going backwards. Places like Australia don't have those types of markets. We do. So this is something that can be dreamt up and implemented. And as actuaries, we're uniquely placed to be able to lead this. And hopefully this presentation has helped some of you to be able to take those ideas forward. So thank you very much for your attention.